Okay, welcome back my friends. So in the previous video, we learned how we can connect the input fields with the variables. And in this video, we are going to focus to this button here. So we want to add some kind of a event listener. So when the user clicks on this button, we want to execute some kind of a function where we are going to add a new task inside this pending tasks list. So let's go to the code. Let's try to identify that button. So here's that button here. So if we want to add some kind of a click listener on this button, then we have to use a directive called v-on. So v-on is a new directive that we just learned. So on v-on is a directive provided by the Vue Framework. And after that, we just have to write a colon, and there we have to write some event we want to react to. So our event is called click. So by doing that, here's what we have defined. So there is an element called button. So there is a button here, and we are saying on the click event, we want to do something. And for now, we will keep this here empty. So basically, we want to execute some kind of a function here or a method here. So where we have to define a method. So how we can define a method that's going to be executed when the user clicks on our button. So until now, we have learned that inside the component, there are several attributes, and the first one was a name, and then there was some kind of a data that we have defined inside our component. And beside that, we can define methods inside our component. So the method is just a simple function that's going to be executed when that function is being called. So in order to add methods to our component, we just have to define an attribute called methods. So methods, and here you add a colon and then curly braces. So basically you just added a simple object here, and here you can define a method. So I will define here a new method called add new task, because in this method we are going to add new task, and then you just define it by opening a normal, and so you just add here two curly braces, and this is our method here. So we just defined our first method, and this is the syntax. Okay, so just to test whether that's working, I will just add here a simple alert saying hello. So once again, we defined a methods here, and inside the methods, I added a simple method here called add new task. If you want to add a second method, then you just put a comma and say another method. And this is the name of the method, another method. In this case here, the name of the method is going to be add new tasks. I will just clean this and delete this, and okay, so now we have our method here, and I will just copy this, go up a bit, and I want to say when the user clicks on this button here, I want to execute this method. So how can I do that? I can just write here the name of the method I want to execute, and basically that's it. So if I go back to the page, if I refresh this page, and if I click here, then voila, my alert is executed. That means I just connected this button here with this method here. So now everything is ready. So once again, how I did that, we just learned a new directive called v-on. So I'm saying on click event, I want to execute this function. And by the way, I just want to say to you, there is a shorter syntax in order to do that. So you can write it like this, or you can write it, just remove this and write a simple @ sign. So this is, then you can read this like @ click. So when the user clicks, just execute this function here. And most of the time you will see this syntax. So I worked on several projects and most of the developers are using this syntax. It's shorter, it's quicker, so I will also use it in my course. So I will leave it that as it is. And I will just go back here, and here is where I'm going to add my task, right? So the first thing I'm going to add is, or I'm going to create, is a new object. So I'll just create a let new task. And here I'm creating a new object. And here, if you look at inside the pending tasks, there are a few attributes that my object should have. The first one is ID, then the name, and then is finished or not. So the first thing I'm going to define is ID. And if you look here, the ID is just a simple integer number. So here I will just use random numbers, right? So I don't have some IDs from the database, so I will just use random numbers. And inside the math library, there is a function called random. So this function is going to give you a decimal number, I think between 0 and 1. So I'll just multiply this with the 10,000s, so I just get a simple integer value. So here I just define my ID. The second thing that I have to define is the name of the task, right? So I'll just put here the name. And then what's going to be our name? How can I get the name of my task? So if you remember from the previous tutorial, we said that every time user writes something to this input field here, so when the user writes something in this input field here, that's going to be automatically saved to the variable called new task name. So I can use this variable called new task name basically to when I'm adding a new object or when I'm defining the name of my task. So how can I access this variable here? So if I want to access this variable, I can just use this dot and then the name of the variable is new task name. And here the this is representing the whole component, and this component has inside the data has a variable called new task name, and here I'm accessing that variable. So, and this value that's defined in this variable is going to be represented as the name of the task. And the last thing that we have to define inside this object is whether the task is finished or not. Well, if we just defined the new task, then the task is not finished. So I'll just print here false. I save this and here is my new task. And I just want to add this new task to this pending tasks array. So how can I do that? As I said, if you want to access a variable or the data inside your component, inside your method, then you just have to print this dot and then variable name. In my case, it's pending tasks. So I'll just write here pending tasks. And because this is now an array, right? So array has a function called push that's going to push a new object inside the array. And my new object is called new task. So I will just write here new task. And believe it or not, that's it. So what we did here is we defined a new object. That new object has attribute called ID, which is just a random number. Then that object has the name, which is the value that user just wrote inside that text field. And then the third attribute is finished, and of course we just added a new task, so that task cannot be finished, so it's false. And at the end we just added that task to the pending tasks array, so we just push that task there. So okay, when I save this, if I go back to the page, if I refresh the page, if I write here new task, so be careful right now, you will see now the power of the Vue framework. So you will see how the values are automatically added to this pending task list. When I click here, then you see here is my new task. But there is now a new thing I just realized this text is not automatically deleted when I add a new task. So I can click here. You see here, this text is not deleted. If I click again, so I'm just adding a new task here. So how can we delete this text, right? So after I push a new task into pending tasks list, what I can do is, it would be cool that I somehow delete or just set the value of this variable new task name to empty string. And if you remember from the previous video, as soon as I change the value of this variable, that's going to be automatically reflected inside this input field. So if I set the value of this variable to the empty string, then there is not going to be anything inside that input field. So I can do that by doing this. Once again, I want to access this data here, or this variable here. So this dot new task name, and I want to set it to be an empty string. So if I do that, if I save, then what's going to be executed once when I click add new task, I will create a new object. I will push that object to the pending tasks list, and at the end, I will set the value of the input field to be an empty string. If I go back to the page, if I refresh this, if I write here new task, and if I click on add task, then you see the new task is added, but now there is nothing inside my input field or text field here. So if I add new, I don't know, buy some stuff, and if I add that task, then you see here that task is added to the end of the list, and then the text is automatically removed. So in this video, we have learned how we can add a simple on-click event on this button. So we just defined here on-click, and then we said, okay, I want to execute this function when the user clicks on this button. And we defined that function or that method inside the methods inside our component. And inside the function body, we created a new object or new task. We push that task to the pending tasks list, and then we just resetted the input field value to be an empty string. The last thing that I'm expecting here is when I click on this checkbox here, that task automatically lands inside the finished task list. And that's what we are going to cover in the next video.